guys, so I'm here to film a video that I thought we might both find interesting. I did a video last year where I read books that were on my TBR that had the lowest rating on Goodreads. I feel like there was a more concise way I could have said that, but you know what I'm referring to. And I was thinking about how I'd had very mixed feelings about all of those books. There'd been books I DNF'd, some I thought were okay, and some I actually really enjoyed from that list. Yet despite that, I still often use Goodreads ratings as an indicator of whether I should buy a book or not, which I don't think there's anything wrong with, because there's got to be a sort of reason to cut the list off somewhere, right, to help you make that decision, make that call, and reviews can be incredibly helpful. I do prefer to actually read reviews and see why people didn't like a book or why people did like a book before I fully make my decision, but the average rating does influence me. But I was thinking it might be interesting to have a look at the books I have actually read and rated on Goodreads and whether I'm in alignment with the average rating. So I'm going to go through my read bookshelf on Goodreads, organise it by lowest rating first, lowest average rating, and then have a look at the 10 books with the lowest average rating that I've also read and see how I rated them and what I thought of them and whether I do sort of agree with the masses or whether my opinions are higher or lower or what have you. That's kind of what I'm aiming for this video to be. I don't know what I'm going to call it yet, but I think it might be interesting to review those 10 books, whatever they may be for you. So let's just go through them all quickly first whilst I'm recording my screen so you can see them all, and then I'll go into detail about each one. There's the Ephesian Tale, which is the lowest on this list. It's an ancient Greek novel. Then there is Glubslime by Jacqueline Wilson, a children's book that I read as a child. Gingerbread by Helen Oyeyemi, which was actually in fact one of the books I read during my reading my lowest rated books on my TBR video, if you recall. Then there's The 10th Girl by Sarah Faring, Dead Girls, Essays on Surviving an American Obsession by Alice Bolin, Glisser by John Burnside, Rhesus by Euripides, which is an ancient Greek tragedy, A Double-Barreled Detective Story by Mark Twain, Kim Kardashians Marriage by Sam Riviere, was that 10 or 9? Then Satin Island by Tom McCarthy, which I think is 10. So first up we have the Ephesian Tale by Xenophon of Ephesus, which has an average rating of 2.5, which is pretty low. And as you will have seen from that screen recording, I myself gave it 2 stars. So I am contributing to that overall low rating. To be honest, I'm not sure how many ratings it will have. I didn't expect it to have many. It has literally 10 ratings, so I feel like mine has made a difference there. There is a reason that firstly not a lot of people are rating this book and not a lot of people are rating it highly, and that's because it's generally speaking just not a very popular piece of ancient literature for the reason that it's not great. Now I think there's a lot of merit in most of the surviving literature from ancient Greece and Rome. In fact, there's merit in all of it because it contributes to, you know, our knowledge of those historical periods. However, you tend to have surviving some of the best works because you have the works that have been preserved. So even if you don't personally like them or you find your opinions are in contrast with what they're saying, there's usually some sort of merit literary-wise when it comes to that piece of literature because people have made an effort to preserve it. Now, some ancient literature we didn't preserve and we sort of discovered ancient papyri of in the more recent past, but that's like less often the case than it is that it's been preserved, if that makes sense. Often bad literature doesn't survive, but that doesn't mean it wasn't written, and to be honest, the Ephesian Tale is just bad. Like, it's just not a very good book. It's one of 5 surviving ancient Greek novels, which was a sort of genre that arose during the Hellenistic period and then continued into the sort of period of the Roman Empire, and they were all these like romance stories written in prose, and it's one of my favourite subgenres of ancient Greek literature. I've read all 5. I wrote my dissertation on 2 of them. I think they're so interesting, but because of my interest in the genre itself, but I only read Xenophon of Ephesus' book because of my interest in the genre in itself, and it is most certainly the weakest of the 5. It's just meh. and even most classical scholars haven't bothered to read it for that reason. If you are interested, my absolute favourite ancient Greek novel is Daphnis and Chloe by Longus, but I also very much enjoy Achilles Tatius's Leucippe and Cleitophon. So then we have Glubslime by Jacqueline Wilson, which is a children's book. Jacqueline Wilson was one of my favourite and most read authors as a child. I mentioned that recently in my video where I talked about the authors I have read the most books by, and Glubslime was actually one of my favourites, so this really surprises me. It has an average rating of 2.95, and I retroactively have given it 5 stars. I didn't rate it when I read it, because I read it when I was a child, when I didn't have Goodreads, and I doubt Goodreads existed, but I remember it so fondly that I've just given it 5 stars because of the feeling I remember it giving me as a child. It has 1,616 ratings though, so, you know, not a small number that have contributed to this average. Why might it have such a low rating from my perspective as somebody who enjoyed it is maybe because it is quite different from a lot of Jacqueline Wilson's books. It's not like full-blown fantasy, but it has fantastical elements, and that is true of some of Jacqueline Wilson's books, but her literature tended towards the contemporary side of life, focusing on a lot of the hardships that children can face in their life. And this book does touch on contemporary themes. From what I remember, it touches on themes of friendship and bullying and not fitting in. Deal with other things as well, but my memory's a little bit hazy. However, there was a talking frog. There was a talking frog and a little girl who finds this talking frog, who basically decides to become her familiar and teacher about witchcraft. However, the witchcraft or magic that she then performs always seems a little bit convenient. For example, anything that could have been caused by her spells could really have just been caused by life anyway, so the magical element never really feels like invasive or necessarily even real, aside from the talking frog. And I loved this book when I was a kid. The library had the audio cassette tape of it, and I used to get it out again and again, so I listened to it multiple times. And to be honest, as a child, I still loved a little bit of fantasies, so most likely that injection of a talking animal, which again, was a big fan of as a child, into a Jacqueline Wilson book was something that for me was really going to work, but obviously did not for other people. We then have Gingerbread by Helen Oyemi, which has an average rating of 3.05, and I gave 4 stars. Now, what I remember from reading this book in my lowest rated books on my TBR video was that it's a complete Marmite. People are like me and give it 4 or 5 stars, or they give it like 1 or 2. People either really don't get on with it or find something in it that they really love, and I can totally understand why. So even though I enjoyed this book, I don't think it's for everybody, and for that reason I'm not that surprised that it's had some like negative reactions from some readers. It is a sort of surreal magical realism book drawing on fairy tale elements from Hansel and Gretel. All of Helen Oyemi's books tend to steer towards that genre, but they're not really retellings of fairy tales. In fact, more than anything, they're sort of lyrical thought experiments. The plot is a little bit hard to follow and get on board with in Gingerbread, but the writing is absolutely stunning, the characters are absolutely fascinating, and the themes of like family and home and relocating are explored in really interesting ways through this sort of weird and wonderful world, and I really enjoyed it for that reason. It's not my favourite Helen Oyemi, but generally speaking I really enjoy her writing. I think she's a beautiful writer, and that was what I got from Gingerbread. It's about a mother and a daughter, and we follow both the story of the mother's childhood growing up in this country that everyone else is sort of in denial exists, like you can't find it on a map, and now she lives in the UK with her daughter who's never actually been to her home country, and that's kind of the best job I can do in summing it up. We then have The 10th Girl by Sarah Faring, which we return to a book I'm kind of on board with the average rating for. So the average rating is 3.07 and it has an average rating of 3. Again, I noticed when I looked at the reviews for this one, it kind of was another Marmite. People hated it or loved it, whereas I've obviously given it like a very middle of the road rating, but again, I can completely see why people would rate this book higher. There's also elements of it that I can understand why, if it's really your cup of tea, you might rate it higher, but I found some elements of it to be like kind of problematic or unresolved in a really irritating way that meant I couldn't rate it higher myself. It's an interesting premise about a young woman in the 70s, I think, who goes to become a teacher at a like all-girls private school in like the rural mountains or what have you. But when she gets there, there's something like strange and creepy about this place. And then we also have another narrator who is this like other worldly being. You don't know exactly what they are. They kind of seem like they might be a ghost, and they decide to possess one of the other teachers and develop a relationship with this young woman. And that element is so interesting, but there's this massive plot twist and reveal which you're either going to hate or love. I didn't really like the plot twist because I felt it undermined a lot of the themes that had been brought up during the course of the novel, which included a lot of references to sexual abuse and sexual violence towards these young girls in the school, and that never seemed fully explored to me, thanks in part to the plot twist. So for me it was an interesting journey, but didn't quite work out in the end. We then have Dead Girls by Alice Boleyn, Essays on Surviving an American Obsession. This one, again, I completely understand why it's got this sort of lower average rating of 3.08. I gave it 3 stars, and the reason for that is in large part, I think, the way the book is packaged and marketed. So the title essay, Dead Girls, is this fascinating exploration of our obsession with dead, often like young, beautiful women in like both like fiction, including books and TV and film, but also in like true crime and the media. It explores the way in which these women become like objects, and any like agency or personality or complexity is taken away from them, and sort of like the embedded sexism in those genres. And I thought that essay in particular was brilliant. Like, that was a 5-star essay, do not get me wrong. If you just want to read that essay, this book is still worth picking up, but the rest of the collection has very little to do with any of that. It is far more about LA, the author living in LA, and the author's personal experiences as a creative, and it just felt so jarring and disconnected as a collection. I was really hoping for a lot of interesting like critiques of television and film and literature, as well as like the ways in which the dead girl tropes is used in different types of media and in different ways, but that theme was like very, very loose, and it almost felt forced in moments where it had nothing to do with the essays to try and make it a cohesive collection, when really either it should be marketed as like an essay collection about a writer and critic living in LA, or it should have been an entirely different collection of essays. We then have Glisser by John Burnside, which I gave 4 stars and has a 3.11 stars, so I enjoyed this more than I guess the average person did, although it's been a few years since I read it. Generally speaking, from what I've read of John Burnside, I just really enjoy his prose to begin with. I think he's an incredible writer, and he creates like quite mesmerizing like backdrops and interesting characters. This one follows a young boy who lives in like a rural village where loads and loads of people have been put out of work, and it's just quite like a miserable place to live, which is bad enough, but then you throw in, I think, disappearing children or murdered children, and I mean it just becomes a pretty dark book. It has elements of like a mystery thriller, but more towards the literary end of things, maybe even like a little dribbling of horror, and it gets a little bit surreal as it goes on, which may be one of the reasons that people don't enjoy it as much, because I know some people really don't like surreal elements in their books, so if they've gone into this looking for more like solid answers, then this may not have been the book for them. However, I just generally thought it was like well written and interesting, compelling but incredibly dark. We then have Rhesus by Euripides, which is the first one that I've like given significantly less stars to than the average rating, because I gave this 2 stars and it has an average rating of 3.15. This is another example of what I consider to be a piece of rubbish ancient literature that really probably didn't need to survive. I know some people are going to disagree with me on that, because lots of people have written on this play less than some of Euripides' more popular plays, but I'm sure there are reasons that some scholars think this is interesting from just a like recreational reader's perspective. However, I don't think it's enjoyable. Like, it's just not fun to read. It's like a little bit boring, and I don't have much else to say about it, but then maybe it just doesn't explore themes that I'm interested in ancient literature. I don't know. I find it difficult to entirely separate my like academic brain from my recreational brain when I'm talking about ancient literature, but recreationally I didn't enjoy it. Although, like I mentioned at the beginning of this video, I think every piece of ancient literature has merit from an academic perspective. This one is set during the Trojan War, from what I recall, when Odysseus breaks into Troy in order to try and steal a small statue that the Greeks need to win the war because of a prophecy. It's a play, it's short, there's not much else to say about it. We then have a double-barreled detective story by Mark Twain, which I gave 3 stars and has an average rating of 3.23. This is where I come into the realms of 3 is not a bad rating for me, although I think an average rating of 3 in Goodreads is sort of seen as not a great thing. I don't think 3 is a bad rating in itself because I really enjoyed a double-barreled detective story. It's just a case of when something is like very short and sweet and isn't going to stick with me forever and ever, I don't necessarily feel like I can give it a higher rating than 3 because I just enjoyed it and it was nice at the time. This one is actually a Sherlock Holmes retelling, or a Sherlock Holmes mystery, but written by Mark Twain, which I bet a lot of you didn't know existed. I'm a massive Sherlock Holmes fan, a massive Sherlock Holmes nerd, shall we say, and I love to read Sherlock Holmes books written by other authors as well as the originals over and over and over again. And it was years ago that my dad first learned that Mark Twain had written his own Sherlock Holmes story, and he read it and then I read it, and I was just and it was just amazing to me that somebody even that long ago decided to retell Sherlock Holmes. Like, it's not just a modern phenomenon, that a writer that we sort of think of as a classic now was retelling something that he really enjoyed when he was a reader, and I love that concept and I think it's good fun. I mean, I 100% think the actual Sherlock Holmes books are way better, and that might be one of the other reasons that I sort of felt like I could only give it 3 stars. But if you are into Sherlock Holmes, then it might be a nice little book to check out. We then have Kim Kardashian's Marriage by Sam Riviere. I gave this 2 stars and it has an average rating of 3.22, and it's also the only one that I've written an actual review of. A sentence which says, "This poet and I are evidently just not on the same wavelength." So again, this one I read a few years ago, and I think in particular with poetry, it's kind of hard to remember the nuances of it if it didn't really strike a chord with you. So I couldn't tell you exactly what the poems in this collection were, but I remember just really not getting on with them. They were not stylistically the kind of poetry I like, but I also just don't think they did an incredible job of conveying their themes, or perhaps I just didn't really care for their themes. I think it was sort of dealing with modern life and the vapidity of celebrity or something along those lines, but I just found it a little bit self-righteous, if that makes sense, as a reader. Now, poetry is so specific to the reader. There is no way in high heaven that I would ever enjoy all poetry, even if somebody else loves it, and I think it's great if you can just find the kind of poetry that's for you. This was not for me, and I did not react positively to it, but that's kind of, I think, the nature of poetry in large part. Then last but not least, we actually have the book that I've literally given the lowest rating out of all of these books, and that is Satin Island by Tom McCarthy, which I gave 1 star and has an average rating of 3.23. So actually, I clearly hate this book more than most people, apparently. This book was shortlisted for the Man Booker Prize in 2015, which was why I read it. I would not have necessarily picked it up if it were not for it being shortlisted for that prize, and evidently I hated it. I feel 1 star is fair to say is a hate rating. 2 stars is, I didn't enjoy this book, but whatever. 1 star is, I really did not like this book, and I definitely didn't like Satin Island. It's a very experimental book, which again is probably a reason why people have very disparate opinions on it, very extreme reactions to it. I, however, thought the experiment was pointless. It's an experimental piece of literature, and I personally kind of expect experimental literature in particular to be quite thought-provoking. This, on the other hand, was not. It, again, felt a little bit self-indulgent and pretentious. The book very much thought it was doing something really creative and new, but actually came out with something just very overwrought. And to be honest, the only reason I actually even finished it was because it was very short, so it's got that going for it, I guess. But what a way to end this video. Those are the 10 books that I have read which have the lowest average rating on Goodreads and my personal thoughts on them, which are very much varied. There was some 4 stars, 5 stars, 1 stars, 2 stars and 3 stars in there, so literally everything I could have given a book, although it's perhaps not that surprising to see that other people have also clearly not enjoyed some of the books I have given 1 or 2 star ratings to. I would love to know what are some of the books that you've read that aren't very popular, that have low ratings, that people don't seem to like very much, and what you thought about them. And also let me know if you have any thoughts on the books in this video, because we may entirely disagree and it will be fun to chat about them down below. So until next time, happy reading and I'll see you again soon. Bye guys!